Hi, everyone. I am Dino Scaros, and this is the Society of Presidential Historians in Academia, SOFIA Presidential Podcast. We are the only open enrollment academic society that is exclusively focused on the US presidents and their presidencies. If you're interested in SOFIA, you'd like to find out more about us and like to become a member, you can scan the QR code here on your screen or just go to the website sophiascholars.com. Today we are here with Dr. Jody Baumgartner, and this is an interesting topic for me, and this is why I thought it would be interesting to our viewers. He will tell you about himself better than I can in a minute, and he wrote an article that I came across not too long ago, doing an analysis on a man named David Blake and his proposal for the reforming of the office of the Vice President of the United States. So, sir, if you can just give us a little introduction of yourself, and then we'll take it away.
Sure. My name is Jody Baumgartner. I am, of all the clunky titles in the world, I'm the Thomas Harriot College of Arts and Sciences Distinguished Professor, take a breath,
Mhm.
in the Department of Political Science at East Carolina University, where I've been for a little over 20 years. Um, the vice presidency is one of my two specialties, interestingly enough. Most scholars have one, I have two. The other one is political humor. I won't say anything more about that today. But that's who I am, and I've been looking at vice presidential stuff for about 20 years now.
Great, great. Well, it's great to have you, and tell us a little bit about what made you decide to analyze this article, because this proposal, because again, Dr. Baumgartner, who's with us, he wrote the article analyzing this position. He is not the one who proposed this vice presidential reform. He did an analysis on it. So, what is it that drew you to doing this?
Sure. So Mr. Blake, David Blake, who was a tech executive, from out in tech world, out in California, had this idea, and it's a laudable idea to be sure, that maybe he could do something in order to reduce the polarization that's in our that's sort of been bedeviling our political landscape for the past couple, 2, 3 decades. And his idea was that instead of a presidential candidate selecting a fellow partisan vice presidential candidate, that it would be better for a partisan presidential candidate to be paired up with a moderate, right? So you'd have an independent or a moderate vice presidential candidate. Um, he he knows his constitutional stuff, to be sure. It turns out, I mean, many of us know this already, but for those who don't, um, the idea that a president and a vice president must run as a ticket that are that sort of agree with each other as a slate or a ticket is not in the Constitution. The vice president is selected completely independently of the president. The idea that they're paired together as a ticket is a product of our party system. So that's where it started. He had this idea. They came to me, not Mr. Blake himself. I never met him, but his people um, came to me and asked me if I would be willing to or interested in talking about the vice presidency on some pre-recorded clips, if you will.
Mhm.
Um, I said, sure. They paid me some money. But when I found out that they were doing a survey, what I said was, as part of my conditions, being the scholar that I am, I said, sure, I'll do it, but I'd like access to these data when it's all over.
Mhm.
They agreed to that. The only condition being that it was, to use the media terminology, um, the data were to be embargoed until after the election. So
Hmm.
I couldn't really publish anything until after the election. So that's really the long, short version of how this came about.
Right. And the election you're talking about is the 2020 election?
That's correct, yes.
Okay, gotcha.
So he
So,
basically ran,
mhm,
and I don't think it got very far, but he basically ran as an independent vice presidential candidate in 2020.
mhm. And if I understand your article correct, he put up $1 million of his own money to get this proposal off the ground?
Correct.
Okay.
And probably I don't know how much more he might have put into it after that. And quite honestly, I almost feel bad, not quite, but I almost feel bad. I didn't really track, in order to run for president or vice president, you have to get on the ballot, right? And
Hmm.
that's a completely separate process that takes a lot of resources because you have to do that in every single state.
Right.
I have no idea how far he made it in that respect.
I thought about a question earlier today, and I don't know if you know the answer, and I don't know the answer, so I'm asking you, and hopefully you do. So okay, what you said earlier, and you put it in your article, is very useful because a lot of people don't know what you said, that electors are not obligated to vote for tickets. Um, but some states have laws against faithless electors because in some states you could say, I'm a delegate for Donald Trump or for Kamala Harris, and then I turn around and vote for, whomever. I vote for Chuck Schumer or Ted Cruz or somebody who's not even running. And you can do that in some states, but not others. But let's take the states that have faithless elector laws. So let's say somebody says, and this is now 2024, just to take the most recent election. Somebody says, I'm a delegate for Donald Trump, but I want Tim Walz to be the vice president I choose. And my reasoning is I prefer Trump over Kamala Harris, but this guy, JD Vance, he's very green. So I'd rather have Tim Walz, who's at least a governor of a state and has a proven record of executive experience. So my votes are for Trump and Walz. Now, is that allowed, do you know, in states that have laws about you can't be a faithless elector because you pledged for Trump and you went for Trump, but then you didn't choose the vice president on Trump's ticket? Would that be allowed?
Well, I think so.
Hmm.
I'm not entirely sure, but I'm pretty sure. I'm pretty
Okay.
sure that would be because I do not believe that selecting a vice president, I just don't know.
Hmm.
I bet there's different states that even specify. So it probably depends on the state.
Sure.
And the reality of it is, let's always remember the faithless electors, to my knowledge anyways, the faithless electors state laws
Mm-hmm.
I don't know have ever been really tested in the Supreme Court because
Mm-hmm.
there's a good argument to be made that those are unconstitutional,
Right. Yes.
right? So if
Yes.
someone were to really, the truth is we've had so few faithless electors
Right.
that no one's really paid attention to it. It's never been
Exactly.
a
It's
whole
never made a
slate.
difference. Yes.
It's been random individuals
Hmm.
who jumped ship, so to speak,
Hmm.
and um, whose defection had no effect on the election whatsoever. Now, if an entire ticket or an entire slate of electors were to behave in that way and it was to change the result of an election, I suspect we'd see a challenge, right?
Sure.
Uh, to that state law or to the whole thing. But I just don't know. I do know this, and I'm sure you do too. Um, Election laws vary widely from state to state
Right.
in a lot of different respects. So
Right.
I think
absolutely.
it's hard to make a generalization about this one. This is what happened in was it 1824? Was 1824 the election that Jackson lost? Yes. There
Yes,
were a
to
good,
John Quincy Adams.
yeah, there were a good six or seven
Hmm.
presidential and vice presidential candidates scattered around.
Right.
It's a fascinating result to look at electorally, that
Yes.
is, the Electoral College, because they weren't necessarily paired up with each other.
Yeah, so what I found interesting about David Blake's proposal, to the extent that I understand it from your article, is it's almost as if what he was describing was the difference between a prime minister of a country and a president of a country, or if we take England, where you have a prime minister and then you have a king. And some other countries where you have the day-to-day leaders and then you have the elder statesmen. And so what I found, in my opinion, difficult to reconcile, because when I think of presidents and vice presidents in corporations, the president is basically the head and the vice presidents work for the president. And I think what David Blake was proposing was this kind of role where the vice president is sort of above the fray. And then I was thinking, that might work if you had a different title. And I'm not suggesting this title, but sort of an ombudsman for the people. But if you're the vice president, it's just kind of hard, for me anyway, to swallow that the president is somehow accountable to the vice president. So I was just curious about your thoughts.
Okay, so to my mind, anyways, and
Hmm.
when I say to my mind, in my professional judgment,
Hmm.
the 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 biggest flaw in Mr. Blake's idea, and we can call it idealistic, we can call it naivete if we want to,
Hmm.
um, is that he didn't really seem to understand the nature of of the vice presidency itself. The modern vice presidency, say post Mondale to be starting with Mondale to be sure,
Hmm.
but even going back, the roots of the modern vice presidency are with probably Richard Nixon under Eisenhower, where
Hmm.
vice presidents start becoming more influential, more integral, more active uh, in their president's administration. Um, they, 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 they seem to matter more, right?
Right.
As opposed to hanging around checking to see whether the president died every morning.
Hmm.
Um, but the caveat is this: vice presidents are only as active as their presidents allow them to be.
Yes. Hmm.
And so it was kind of a strange kind of dynamic there, right? He envisioned being this person who was above the fray, or someone who would sort of float between and try and moderate or mediate, try and find middle ground. But no one's going to do that if you don't have the confidence of the president. And you won't have the confidence of the president if you're not selected from the president's party, if you haven't selected him, right? The vice presidential selection process, the way they select these candidates
Hmm.
is a very personalized thing. They vet these people extensively, then they
Hmm.
meet with them, right, to figure out things like compatibility with respect to issues, personality compatibility, right? And one of the famous things, one of the core principles is you have to be loyal to the president.
Right.
That was articulated by George H.W. Bush while he was vice president. That's the core value right there. Uh, and in fact, Bush went even further by saying, "Look, not only do you have to be loyal to the president, but if it's a good idea, if you have a good idea, it's the president's idea.
Hmm.
And if you do something good, don't take credit for it." Right?
Hmm.
So I think he saw the vice president as being slightly more independent, having a slightly greater independent power base than the vice presidents do in reality.
Right. It's interesting because of your background in the vice presidents. I often thought about, we'll jump to a specific vice president. I often thought about Nixon. And of course, Nixon's first vice president was Spiro Agnew, and he resigned because of his own looming scandal that had nothing to do with Watergate, but it was around the time of Watergate. And so he basically didn't help Nixon's case. He resigned. I often wondered, because Spiro Agnew was quite a polarizing figure, do you think, and of course this is speculation, do you think that had Agnew not had his own scandal, had he been Nixon's vice president, would the Democrats have been less likely to plan to impeach Nixon for fear that if they got rid of Nixon, Spiro Agnew would be the president, which they didn't want, and maybe to some extent would have preferred Nixon. Whereas once Gerald Ford came in, they said, okay, we'd much prefer Ford to Nixon because Ford was that sort of more moderate person that David Blake envisioned, I think. And on top of that, second part to the question is because Ford may not have been the guy in the room in the inner circle, nobody blamed him, nobody attached him to the Watergate scandal. People were upset with him later on when he pardoned Nixon, but when he, in that month before he took office and pardoned Nixon, nobody thought, okay, this guy's part of that same dirty crew because he really wasn't in the room. So I guess my question is, do you think it might have been different if Agnew was in? And then what about that situation where you have vice presidents who are kind of kept out of the inner circle discussions, even now where presidents handpick their vice presidents?
Yeah, the Agnew point is great. I love that. I'm not sure I've ever heard that before, but I think you're dead spot on with that. I think it probably would have changed the political calculus of the Democrats, and let's be fair, the Republicans
Hmm.
who were pushing for Nixon's removal, and that was not the case. There were very few people as I'm sure you know, in legislative DC that were more respected at that time than Gerald Ford.
Hmm.
Not necessarily for his legislative prowess, but for his the way he worked with everybody.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's a great point. Um, with respect to how he was able to keep himself separated from Nixon, I think that situation still prevails to some extent. I was thinking immediately when you started talking about that, I started thinking about, did Al Gore have a bit of a stain on him with respect to the Clinton impeachment thing? And the answer is yes. But I think many people, maybe even most people, felt a little sorry for Gore because Gore himself was lied to,
Hmm.
right? Um, so it's an interesting one. I don't think at the end of the day, the only thing I think we blame vice presidents for with respect to presidents
Hmm.
is whether or not they're supporting unpopular policies. So, did Harris distance herself from Biden sufficiently? I don't think so. Not in my opinion.
Hmm.
Um, in the same way that Humphrey really did not distance himself sufficiently from Johnson with respect to the Vietnam War. And
Hmm.
I think they both paid for that. Gore, on the other hand, tried, and I think successfully enough.
Hmm.
Uh, but that wasn't a policy issue. That was it. Remember in the 90s we were talking about the character issue,
Hmm.
right?
Right.
So. Yeah, that's an interesting point.
I mean, I always compared Gore in 2000 to Nixon in 1960, vice presidents who were considered competent, who were vice presidents to popular presidents, because of course you remember, despite Clinton's impeachment, he remained very popular, and Eisenhower certainly was immensely popular. But I think Nixon and Gore suffered from the human connection, the likability factor, and that may have done them in more so than anything else.
I think so too. I think there's also and I realize you're a historian. It risks sounding like historical determinism, but as we both know, there's only two sitting vice presidents who have ever been elected directly to the presidency, Martin Van Buren and George H.W. Bush. Um, a vice president will absolutely get his party's nomination for president
Hmm.
without much contest at all. Can they win the presidency, though? That's a different question. And there's a number of reasons why that might be the case. But I always remember when I first started studying the vice presidency, there was an article written, oh gosh, way back in the 80s,
Hmm.
that referred to the Van Buren jinx, right? The idea
Right.
that sitting vice presidents probably won't be able to make it to the presidency. Now, sit out a term, and that's a different story.
Hmm.
But yeah, part of it is the individuals. Yeah, Al Gore came off as it was tough to really like Al Gore. He was not the most personable guy.
Hmm.
He was a little bit stiff. Nixon certainly had his issues with that as well.
Hmm.
So I'll stop talking now.
No, no, no. That's great. That's great. And so what got you interested in the vice presidents in particular?
I'm afraid this is going to be a real disappointing answer.
No, it's okay.
Um, but I'm going to answer it.
Hmm.
Uh, I was out there. I got my PhD in 98,
Hmm.
and by 2003, I was still looking for a tenure track job.
Hmm.
Um, in June of 2003, I finished my second book and said to myself, never mind, I'm done. I'm not doing any more of this.
Hmm.
Apparently, I'm not supposed to be a college professor. So I just stopped. I said, I'm not doing any more research until I get a job. And I was pretty sure I wasn't going to get a job.
Hmm.
So when I got to East Carolina University, I had no research agenda whatsoever. Um, and I knew that had to change. So I walked over to the library and I was looking at the time, I was also interested in right-wing and fringe presidential candidates. This was based on my dissertation.
Hmm.
And I happened to see a book on the vice presidency, and I don't remember which one it was.
Okay.
And I said, huh, vice presidents, vice
Hmm.
presidential candidates. I wonder if there's anything here.
Hmm.
So I started digging up everything I could find on vice presidential candidates. I wrote a paper. It's one of the most pathetic papers I've ever written in my life because it had like 18 tables of statistics.
Hmm.
I presented it at a conference, and then after that, I realized I had enough material for a book. So that's how it. So it happened kind of accidentally, is what it comes down to.
Hmm. No, that's a great story. How many books have you written?
I should know this number.
No, that's good. This sounds like a lot. So if you have to
Between
pause, it sounds like a lot.
between solo author, co-authors, or edited books, I
Mhm.
think it's 12 or 13 by this point.
Very
And
nice. And can you rattle off some titles where some viewers here might be able to find your book, say on Amazon,
sure. Um,
including me, by the way. I'm gonna write these down.
the vice presidency stuff,
Hmm.
we'd be looking for um I'm actually looking at my Vita now.
Hmm.
Um, um yeah, so The American Vice Presidency Reconsidered was the first one, but I wouldn't recommend that book. I would go for the 2015, The Vice Presidency, then after the colon, it's From the Shadow to the Spotlight. Um,
Okay.
my first vice presidency book was really, really, really heavy on vice presidential candidates, and that was only obvious to me after a couple years of it being out.
Hmm.
Um, the publisher did not want to do a second edition. I understand why. I bought the copyright and used about a quarter or a third of that book in recrafting a better, more balanced version of a vice presidency book. So that's the one. I've also got a number of books on political humor as well. The latest of which is called Modern Political Caricatures. I can see Russia from my house. Ha! I love that. I love that title, even if most people don't get it anymore.
Right, right. And what's interesting about that is when Tina Fey did that skit, a lot of people actually thought Sarah Palin did say those exact words.
Yep,
I remember.
yep. That's the power of political caricatures. In the same way that a lot of people believe that Al Gore said, "I invented the
I
internet."
invented the internet. Yeah. So very, very, very true. Okay, well, we're winding down on time. Is there anything else you'd like to share before we go?
No, not necessarily unprompted. I could talk about this stuff all night long, or at
Oh, and
least
that's great. Okay, well, let's do it this way. What is one interesting thing about the vice presidents that most people might not know that you think is useful for people to know?
to my mind, based
Hmm.
on the last, not, okay, let's forget about J.D. Vance for the moment.
Hmm.
Let's look at Harris and Pence.
Okay.
Um, Let me see. I'm trying to condense this down into a bite-sized thing.
Hmm.
Um, Since Richard Nixon, the institution of the vice presidency has been getting more and more active, more powerful, more integral to their president's administrations. They now have their own staff. They now have funding for their own staff, things like that, which sounds trivial, but that was not the case. The vice president's office used to be in the Senate
Hmm.
because he was he was the president of the Senate. Um, but it's not necessarily a linear growth, is one of the interesting things. And in particular, we get to Mike Pence, who was really all but irrelevant as a
Hmm.
vice president. Joe Biden was at Obama's side all the time. Dick Cheney, heck, the critics of Dick Cheney thought that he was the one pulling Bush's strings,
Hmm.
right? Gore was a powerful vice president.
Hmm.
But we come to Pence, and he's marginalized would be a
Hmm.
generous way to say it, right? And I think we have to say the same thing about Kamala Harris. Now, the reasons for those two things, the reasons that each were marginalized or not necessarily empowered by their presidents are different in each case. What really stands out, however, is the idea that, as I said earlier, vice presidents are only as powerful as their presidents want them to be.
Right.
In the case of Trump, or in the case of Pence, it was very clear. I'm not a psychiatrist,
Hmm.
and I don't know anything about this, but one would have to guess that Trump was reluctant to be overshadowed or share the spotlight with anybody,
Hmm.
including his vice president. With Harris, my own personal theory is that Biden had to select. Biden was forced into selecting Harris. I don't think he wanted her.
Hmm.
He had already said he was going to select a woman.
Hmm.
And after the George Floyd stuff in the summer, um, no one said it, but I think the strong sense was it would have to be a woman of color.
I'm not certain. I thought Biden himself said a woman of color, but I could be wrong.
Maybe he did.
Mm,
If he didn't, it was going to have to be anyways. That was the
right.
reality of it. So
Mm,
how many women of color were there with this sort of national stature?
right.
And I that Abrams down in Georgia.
Mhm.
So I always forget the mayor of Los Angeles, her name. There weren't that many choices.
No, and I think Harris made a national name for herself, not so much from her own presidential run, which really flopped, in 2020, but when she was on the committee, I think it was for the confirmation of Kavanaugh for the Supreme Court. I think that's when she had gained some traction. So I agree with you. If you're gonna choose a Democratic woman of color, she was really the recognizable
Right.
choice.
And my work on how they select these candidates points to the idea that national name recognition absolutely matters. But
Mhm.
the underside of that story is, and again, this is just my theory, it's my pet theory. I was watching the night that in the first Democratic debate when she took what I considered to be, what others considered to be, not everybody, a pretty cheap shot at Joe Biden
Hmm.
with respect to his politics about race and segregation in the early 70s.
Hmm.
I remember watching it thinking, oh my God, that's a cheap shot. Listen, presidential candidates and their people, they don't forget that stuff.
Hmm.
I don't think they ever got past that. I just don't think they ever got past that.
And
And I
that's
think
a
that's why they tasked her with either meaningless or impossible thing. The border czar of all things,
right.
right?
That
Um,
that's a great point. And even though we're going a little past, this has been I found this to be a great interview, and I can't resist to ask one more question.
please.
I know that I mean, as a voter, and this is regardless of party. As a voter, I've always admired presidential nominees who didn't necessarily take the politically easy route. For example, like you mentioned, Bush and Cheney, Bush, the younger Bush, George W., he took on a vice presidential nominee that a lot of people at the time thought should have been the front runner, but he did it anyway.
Hmm.
Obama could have taken the easy way out and chosen Hillary Clinton. He took Biden, who was a good balance to the ticket, but not necessarily a superstar. And then I'm thinking, though, to Bush the father, why did he take Dan Quayle, who was clearly not overshadowing? And so it's a two-part question. Why do you think he took Dan Quayle? And am I right to put Quayle in that category like a Pence or a Harris who were not really utilized as vice president?
Whale was selected. Now we have to remember that this was still very early in this new model, right?
Mhm.
The new model is really cemented with Mondale.
Right.
Bush spends a couple of years actually out in the wilderness himself under Reagan and really doesn't get elevated into the inner circle until after Reagan got shot
Hmm.
and Bush would not allow the Marine One helicopter to land on the White House lawn with him in it. He said to everybody, no, 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 no. Marine One only lands on the White House lawn when the president's in it. So that demonstrated his loyalty to both Reagan and his inner circle. Point. It's still a young model at this point.
Hmm.
Quayle is selected because he's got uh, seriously solid conservative credentials. He's young and he's good looking. That's why. Um, Now you need a little bit more than that as time goes on. By the way, I will suggest to you,
Hmm.
just as something to think about, um, the track record of vice presidential selection is that you don't pick your rival. Now,
Mm-hmm.
Ronald Reagan did,
Mm-hmm.
but I say that because Hillary Clinton was never going to be selected by Barack Obama. Even though it made on the face of it, it made a lot of sense,
Mm-hmm.
right? But there was too much bad blood there
Mm-hmm.
between the two of them at that point.
Yep.
So I'm not,
Good
I'm not sure
point.
that actually got at your question, though, did it?
No, it did about Quayle, and yeah, I mean, you answered it spot on, absolutely. Um,
Quayle, so when I said vice presidential power has been increasing, it has not been a linear progression.
right.
And it's fair to say that it dips a little bit with Quayle, right?
Yes.
He
Mm-hmm.
wasn't marginalized. He was utilized. Bush tried to bring him in,
Mm-hmm.
right? But he didn't distinguish himself in any way. So in fact, a lot of people obviously argue that he undistinguished himself in many respects.
Right. Right. Good point. Okay, well, thank you for very enlightening information, and I'm going to take a look at your book from the shadow to the spotlight about the vice presidency, and I will let you know when this airs on our YouTube channel. Thank you again for this, and thank you to everybody listening, and please stay tuned for our next podcast.